In this new series, we will talk about Berlin, the most iconic and unsettling city of the Cold War era, which began right after the end of World War II. After the Second World War, a very interesting situation emerged in Berlin. As Germany's defeat became inevitable even before the war had ended, the Allied powers began debating the existence and future of Germany. One of the central points of these debates was Berlin. After the war, the eastern part of Germany came under Soviet control. The western part, on the other hand, was controlled by the Western Allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. The capital, Berlin, was a city located about 170 to 180 kilometers inside the Soviet-controlled area. Despite this, an agreement among the Allies divided Berlin itself into four sectors. The eastern part of the city was under Soviet control, while the three western sectors were under the control of the Western Allies. So, even though Berlin was located within the area occupied by the Soviet Union, its western side was under Western Allied control. If we want to examine the Soviet view of post-war Germany, we can say this. In a meeting in June 1945, Stalin told German communist leaders that he hoped to gradually undermine the British position in the occupied zones, that the United States would withdraw within a year or two, and that nothing could then prevent the establishment of a unified Soviet-controlled Germany. He believed that Germany's industry and resources should feed the Soviet economy as war reparations. In fact, immediately after the war, factories, equipment, technicians, managers, and skilled personnel were transferred to the Soviet Union. Moreover, to control Germany was to control Europe. If we look at the Western Allies' view of post-war Germany, we should say this. Although the war had ended, the threat of the Soviet Union and communism was becoming apparent. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had brought all of Eastern Europe under its influence. There was fear of Soviet expansionism, both ideologically and militarily. The United States and the United Kingdom decided to rapidly rebuild Germany as a buffer state against the Soviet Union. For this reason, in the following years, many German generals and officers who had served under Nazi Germany were reinstated in the new German army. The Western Allies did not want to leave Berlin entirely to the Soviets due to the city's historical, political, and economic importance. There was a belief that the power controlling the city would also control Germany. Therefore, both the Soviets and the Western Allies built their post-war plans around fully dominating Berlin. The negotiations between the Soviets and the Western powers during their alliance produced no clear result. Soon after, the wartime alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union ended, and friendly relations turned hostile. The question of whether West Berlin would remain under Western Allied control or be added to Soviet-controlled East Germany triggered the first crisis of the Cold War. This issue was essentially about how Germany's future would be shaped. At that time, 2.5 million Berliners, spread across the four occupation zones, were facing deep poverty. The Allied bombings had left the city in ruins, and the black market dominated the city's economic life. In 1947, the policy of controlling Germany saw major changes. On January 1st, the Western Allies merged their occupied zones in Western Germany. In June, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced the European Recovery Program. This was the program that would become known as the Marshall Plan. The purpose of this program was not only to support economic recovery in Western Europe, but also to draw other states into the economic orbit of the United States, creating a bulwark against communism. At the beginning of 1948, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France began secretly planning the establishment of a new German state in the Western occupied zones. In March, when the Soviets discovered these plans, they withdrew from the Allied Control Council, which had regularly coordinated occupation policies since the end of the war. In June, American and British officials introduced the new Deutschmark to West Germany and West Berlin without notifying the Soviets. The Allies transported 250 million Deutsche Marks into the city, and this new currency became the standard in all four sectors. The aim of this monetary reform was to take economic control of the city away from the Soviets, enable the arrival of Marshall Plan aid, and eliminate the black market. In response, the Soviets took similar actions in their own zone. They introduced their own currency, the Ostmark. Thus, Berlin became a divided city with two different currencies, circulating in two different regions. The Soviets escalated further by cutting off all main road, rail, and canal connections from West Germany to West Berlin. They also shut off the water lines to the city. At that time, West Berlin had only 36 days' worth of food and 45 days' worth of coal. One major factor the Soviets relied on when initiating the blockade was that there was no formal agreement guaranteeing road or rail access to Berlin through the Soviet zone. However, after Germany's surrender, 3 air corridors had been designated to provide access to Berlin by air from Hamburg, Buckeberg, and Frankfurt. But the conditions were not clearly defined because the Western Allies had assumed the Soviets would not cause problems with access. After World War II, the majority of US and British troops had returned home. Therefore, they were militarily in a weak position. In contrast, the Red Army kept its occupation force around Berlin. In short, the only connection between Berlin and the Western Allies was the air corridors used to supply the city. The Western Allies decided to supply Berlin by air. Their reasoning was that, even if the Soviets opposed the airlift, they would not attack unarmed humanitarian flights. On June 26th, the United States launched Operation Vittles, and 2 days later, the United Kingdom launched Operation Planefare. The start of the airlift was difficult. In the early months of the airlift, the Soviets used various methods to harass Allied aircraft. Throughout the airlift, Soviet and German communists subjected the people of West Berlin to constant psychological warfare. On radio broadcasts, they repeatedly announced that all of Berlin had come under Soviet control and that the city would soon be abandoned by the Western occupying powers. Western diplomats called on the Soviets to seek a diplomatic resolution. The Soviets offered to lift the blockade if the Western Allies withdrew the new Deutschmark from West Berlin. The United States and the United Kingdom refused. Fearing that the Allies might halt the airlift and leave West Berlin to the Soviets, 300,000 West Berliners gathered at the Reichstag to show their opposition to Soviet rule. At the time, City Council member Ernst Reuter took the microphone and pleaded for his city. "People of the world, you people of America, of England, of France, look upon this city and do not abandon these people." The crowd surged toward the Soviet-occupied zone, and someone climbed up and tore down the Soviet flag flying above the Brandenburg Gate. Soviet military police responded harshly. The massive turnout encouraged the West to continue the airlift. Over time, the airlift became more efficient and the number of planes increased. Starting 2 days after the blockade, from June 26, 1948, U.S. and British aircraft carried out over 270,000 flights, delivering about 2.3 million tons of supplies to West Berlin over 11 months, the largest humanitarian airlift in history. At its peak, a plane was landing at Berlin's airport every 45 seconds. By the spring of 1949, the success of the airlift was clear. The Western Allies had proven they could continue the operation indefinitely. At the same time, the Western Allies launched a blockade against Soviet-controlled Germany. This caused severe shortages, and Moscow feared it could lead to political unrest. On May 11, 1949, Moscow lifted the blockade of West Berlin. The Berlin crisis of 1948 to 1949 exposed the division of Europe. Just before the end of the blockade, the Western Allies founded NATO. 2 weeks after the blockade ended, the state of West Germany was established. And soon after, the Soviets created their own state in East Germany. The event drew a clear line between East and West in Europe. Berlin became one of the few places in the world where US and Soviet armed forces stood face to face. This process also transformed Berlin, once associated with Prussian militarism and Nazism, into a symbol of democracy and freedom in the fight against communism.